Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. Last time we talked about premise and the early steps for creating a project. From there, one of the next steps is to choose a genre. If you're curious, genre is actually French and means to sort, style, or kind, as in type or group. Pretty apt use, I would say, as the definition for artistic compositions is a classification or category system that groups compositions, which in this case means film, television, music, and literature, using similar styles, themes, content, or elements. Now, those elements are things that have been socially agreed upon for quite a long time. Basically, people saw stories with similar things and just started grouping them together. Of course, that system took more than a few conversations to perfect. Though in today's day and age, we've become so accustomed to these groupings that they've really become second nature. It's hard to imagine a time when people didn't agree on what it meant when you said fantasy. Bit of history to share here that I thought was very interesting. Before it was known by its current French name, genre was first introduced by Plato, the Greek philosopher, and he classified literary work into three primary categories: poetry, drama, and prose. Now, the sad part is I can't find what his name for genre was, so if you do, please leave it in the comments below. Another definition to know is subgenre. Now, that refers to a combination of two primary genres or a blending of elements within a primary genre. In this video, I want to not only list the major genres, but I want to go into detail about them, explain them so that you better understand. Of course, if there's interest in me doing so, and you guys all comment that you want to see it, I can do a video where I go into a little bit of the history of some of these genres. Maybe not all of them, but a few of the more interesting ones. For the subgenres and combos, you're just going to have to go online to learn more about them. I can talk a little bit about a few. The problem that you're going to find there is literally hundreds, if not thousands, of subgenres. So it's kind of hard to list them all and talk about them all. Really, the only thing that I can do is give you a few and go from there. But over the course of your work, you may run into a few, or when you publish, you'll see a few, and you can just go from there. But a big point that I want to make is not just to list the genres and describe them, but offer you guys kind of the pros and cons of each. Now, the thing is, there's not really cons, but they're more what I would call requirements. I mentioned that genres have socially agreed upon elements, and the reason that I want to talk about these things is what those elements are, what is required on your behalf in order to, I don't want to say qualify, but to be counted with that genre. If you leave certain things out, it's not going to be the same. So there's really things that you need to do and you need to provide in order to be some of these specific genres. So it's best that you understand. It's best that you realize what it takes to do some of these things, what goes into creating these projects, because some of them are a little more labor intensive than you may know. And that's important to get across. That's something that a lot of people don't realize when they first start out, just how much goes into the process just to be a part of a genre. And that's a big difference, because being in a genre versus just writing a story is a big difference. There's a lot that is required. For some of the genres, that's not true. For some of the genres, it's very, very simple. They are really easy to create. They're really easy as entry points for new writers. And that's why you see a lot of certain genres on the market, because they're a lot more approachable for people. What are the main genres of literature? There's action adventure, comedy, drama, fantasy, usually broken into two categories, not even subgenres, but it's usually broken into two categories, which is high fantasy and low fantasy. There's also historical, horror, mystery, paranormal, science fiction, thriller, and suspense. Now, one could make an argument that horror, thriller, suspense, and mystery all go in the same category. Make it an overall thriller genre. And technically, that wouldn't be all that incorrect. So I leave it up to you to decide. For nonfiction, the genres are biography or autobiography, essays, informational pieces, narratives, and speech anthologies. Poems can use the same genres as fiction, but usually do it in more of a variety of ways. And given the list of the rules required for those ways, we'll cover that over a couple of different episodes. But that's for poetry time. This is genre time. The big thing of genre isn't just knowing which one you want to use, it's what goes into each genre. So let's break it down like this. Common elements for each, and then the pros and cons, or pros and requirements, if you will. So let's start at the top. Action, adventure. The primary elements are, as with many genres on the list, right in the title, action and adventure. Think of it like this. The main characters go on an adventure and experience a lot of action along the way. And not necessarily that kind of action, but it's possible. Now, one thing that you're going to see me talk about over the course of this video is the fact that a lot of the genres can be set historical. It's a genre all of itself, and we talk about it as standalone, but a lot of genres can be either modern or historical. And a good example of historical action adventure story is Indiana Jones. Another thing to keep in mind is setting a story as action adventure can actually make the elements a little more manageable. And we'll talk about why in the pros and requirements section. The next genre to talk about is comedy. Now, as you can imagine, the most important element here is humor. When you think of a comedy story, think of a literary sitcom. It's lighthearted, has a bit of a journey, and no real darkness. Some heartache is fine, but this isn't the genre for peril. Of course, it could be argued that comedy is just an offshoot of drama because it often contains dramatic elements. But really, despite that, comedy is its own category. Comedy is lighthearted, has lots of jokes, and is truly the feel-good genre. And since we just mentioned it, the next genre is drama. Dramas are usually a heartwarming or heartbreaking story. There's no real risk except loss. Dramas involve a lot of emotions, contain a lot of dialogue, and use a lot of interactions. And there's usually a good soul-searching journey. More often than not, they will either be modern day or historical, because you do find a lot of historical dramas on the market. Next up is fantasy. Now, as I said, there are two not subgenres to the fantasy world. There's high fantasy and low fantasy. High fantasy is probably what you picture in your mind when somebody says the word. You may imagine castles and elves and dragons and swords and magic and all those type of elements. That is what you would classify as high fantasy. There are others. There's a lot of elements that are usually common with high fantasy, but that's just an example list. Low fantasy contains a minimal amount of those elements and is usually set in, I don't want to say modern times, but it's set in a familiar setting. For now, we'll use modern times and say that low fantasy is an intrusion of some one or two high fantasy elements within a modern setting. Elves driving cars or magic at the coffee shop, things like that. That is where you would see more of a low fantasy. Only one or two elements from high fantasy in a standard story, in a standard setting. Next up is historical. As I said before, a lot of the primary descriptors for some of the genres are right in their names. As soon as you say what it is, you understand. And that is especially true with historical. It always takes place in the past. It may change genres. It may change story types. It may be a little more action adventure. It may be a drama. It may be supernatural. It may be scary, but it's always set in the past. Now, your best bet for that is anything earlier than right about 1999. Any time period that is beyond 5 or 10 years can be considered historical, but I would go 90s or earlier to really be, at this point in time, to be considered historical. 80s, 70s, 1800s, things like that. You want to go a little bit further back. You want to change the world and roll it back to a simpler time period. And while we're in the H's, next is horror. Horror is all about the dark, the creepy, the scary. It can be set modern or historical, but really needs to fall into the realistic category. We're not going too fantastical with it. We're going for something dark, something visceral, something to really crawl under the audience's skin. That's where you get your horror. You want them afraid. That's the true element of the horror genre. Next up is mystery. For now, let's treat this genre as separate. Mystery is where all the whodunits reside. There's something the main characters have to solve. And yes, the murder mystery is the best example. But it could be something as simple as Scooby-Doo, something unknown. All that requires is the journey the main character or main characters take is about uncovering this unknown information. Whether that's a killer, whether that's some lost information, it's all about that uncovery, all about the mystery. See? It's always in the title. Next up is paranormal, or supernatural, depending on which you prefer. This is where you find all of the things that go bump in the night. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, witches. This is also where things get a little interesting. Paranormal stories often draw from other genres. We see this with historical, and paranormal is very, very similar in that regard because it could have horror elements, it could have comedy elements, it could have action adventure elements. It could be a paranormal mystery. This is one of those categories that is really a chameleon because it blends not only the elements of itself, but elements of another genre as well. However, because it has specific elements that make it up, and that is a requirement as the socially accepted guidelines dictate, paranormal is its own genre, despite the fact that it can insert into others very, very easily. Next up, science fiction. Now, there's a lot of ways to look at this genre. However, the primary element in this genre is a focus on science and technology. That could mean space travel. That could mean devices. Like fantasy, there are a couple of prominent pseudo-subgenres to focus on here. There's science fiction and what I like to call science faction. Most people will know this subgenre by hard science fiction. The science fiction side is all speculative. It's all taking things beyond what we have. It's all looking to the future. It's imagining what could be. It's taking our technology and our knowledge to their very limits. Science faction or hard science fiction is rooted in what we have now, using exact science, using exact technology, only going as far as we can, not necessarily theorize, but only going so far as we can create today or within the next 5 years. Something that is realistic, something that is happening now and is not too far in the future. There is no speculative to hard science fiction. That is the big difference. Everything in hard science fiction is realistic. It may be bigger, it may be grander, it may be on a scale that we haven't really reached yet, but that scale is 100% possible with today's technology. And if not today's technology, 5 years ahead technology, maybe a decade from now. I'm recording this in 2023, and I would recommend, if you're using hard science, going no further out than 2033, preferably no further than 2030, because it's fairly easy to understand the science we will have in a few years. It's a lot harder a decade or more out. Because if you look back at the technology we had a decade ago and a decade before that, it's really hard to imagine how far we come in short leaps. So it's best to stop at about 5 years and go from there. Otherwise, if you want to go to the really fantastic, then it's straight science fiction. It's all the speculative technology. Next up is thriller or suspense. A big element here is characters on the run or trying to escape. Both thriller and suspense require a lot of tension. Alfred Hitchcock believed that came from subverting the audience's expectations. Thriller is where you get all the twists and turns, usually dark ones at that. So, you know the genres, but how do you pick? A good way to do that is feel. What genre feels right for your story? What elements fit best with the narrative that you want to tell? Another thing to keep in mind is, what are you capable of writing? What are you not capable of writing? I, for instance, struggle with writing comedy. I can write sarcastic, but I struggle with sustained humor. When I think comedy, I usually think something like a Mel Brooks film, and I just don't have the sensibilities to write like that. It's good to understand it about yourself, what you can and cannot do as a writer. That can dictate heavily into what genre you choose. And one of the ways that you know will be pros and cons, the requirements that each one has. So let's talk about that. Back to the top with action adventure. The pros, you know the setting, you know the technology, and there's a lot of excitement. The requirements. You'll hear this a lot, but research. Writing a good action adventure story can be easy. It's just an action movie in book form, but you still need to know a few things. Weaponry, explosions, cars, geography, where countries are, what religions are, what customs are, some technology. And the older the story is set, the more important knowing these things becomes. But we'll cover that in historical. Action adventure is one of the easier genres to write, along with drama, but you do have to know a few things, and that can be the biggest stumbling block. And a lot of that, if you don't know already, is discovered through research. So that is one of the key elements to remember, and it will be key in a lot of these. Next up on the pros and requirements is comedy. So the good aspects, you know the setting, you know the technology. Even if it's set fairly historical, you're still going to understand a lot of what's going on. If you set it modern day, you know the world, you know the rules, all of that stuff. And that is always a positive. The requirements, as I said in the introduction, comedy needs to be funny. Watch an episode of sitcom. There's a joke every couple of lines. When it comes to a script, most insiders say there needs to be 3 to 4 jokes a page, which means 3 to 4 jokes every couple of minutes. The other key is timing, getting your jokes to hit right in the moment. The downside to written comedy is the lack of physical or visual gags. Now, there can absolutely be some, yes, but a written pratfall is not the same as a visual pratfall. In order to get around that, you have to go much further back and study the old radio shows. They rely less on the physical and more on the verbal. The best example, listen to Abbott and Costello's Who's on First sketch. There's nothing physical about it, just a conversation. And it is one of the pillars of comedy. Moving on, drama, the good. Like many of these, if it's set in modern day, you know the world, you know the technology, and you know the setting. If it's set historical, you can still understand that because with a little research, you can see locations and cities and culture and clothing and things like that. All of the primary elements, but it's still all no requirements here. The biggest one is an emotional connection. Emotional investment is an absolute must. You want your reader invested. You want them to feel what your characters feel. For a lot of people, diving deep into emotion can be difficult, but drama absolutely requires it. On to fantasy, the good. There's a lot of room for creativity here in fantasy, so long as you have some of the required elements, and a quick look online will tell you the basics, and as long as you have most of those, you're fine. Which means the rest of the world is yours to create. What the towns look like, the town's layout, the map, the world itself, the technology. As long as they fit in with the aesthetic, it's all up to you. And that for a lot of people is a major positive, being able to create. Now the requirements. And one of the first, much like some other genres, is research. Fantasy is often rooted in reality. Knights and swords are all real, so you need to write them realistically. This means understanding medieval technology. At the same time, it's also helpful to understand medieval villages and towns and castle layouts and capital layouts and how things worked within a city. Even though you're creating the world, you still need to understand how technology works. Even a passing understanding of some of these elements is good enough. Another aspect is laying out the laws of the world. And I don't just mean the court laws. I mean things like how magic works. How is your world different from ours? When you build a world, you have to build it from the ground up. That means understanding layouts and travel routes and building blocks and even religion. Understand every element. For arms and armor, there's a few other YouTube channels that discuss their uses and creation. You'll also need to design the world. Where are mountains? What are seasons? Plants, are they similar to ours? Are they different? Does a different fruit grow? Are crops the same? You need to create everything, from the pebbles to the lore. Now let's talk about the first chameleon, which is historical. The good side is it's a known world and known technology. And what I mean by that is you know the setting, you understand the setting in terms of cities and countries and things like that. And depending on the time period you've chosen, the technology is also readily available. The downside to that is that requires a lot of research. What was available at that time? What is the decade? What is the century you've chosen? And what was the layout? What did they use? What did they speak? That is where historical is a struggle for a lot of people because it requires some of the most research. Because the quickest way to receive criticism is to put historical elements out of context. That will be the thing that I preach most often, especially to you historical writers. Do your research. Look into everything. Understand as much as possible. And even if it's set in the 80s, understand. If you're going to write historical fiction, you need to make friends with a historian or become an amateur version, one of the two. Next up is horror. On the plus side there, you've got a known setting, known world, known technology. There's lots of description and there's lots of emotion to dive into. The hard part here is it can be difficult to capture this genre, to be able to write the scary stuff. To be good horror, the book has to pull the reader in, drag them into the story, and drop them in the shadows. With horror, true horror books, you want to leave the reader afraid of the dark. It's hard to do with just the written word. Sound and visuals play a big part in fear responses, which means you have to make up for that. One aspect that has become fairly common is to make a horror story historic. And the reason for that is the lack of modern conveniences. No cell phones to call for help, no internet. If you want to set a horror story modern day, you have to find a way to negate these advantages. Mystery. Since it's usually set in our world, you know the setting, you know the time, you know the technology. It can be set historical, but let's take it from a modern standpoint. The requirement here is the truth unfurls over time. There's usually lots of twists and turns. There's red herrings. There's misdirections. You don't want your main characters to know the ending and you don't want your audience to know the ending. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, I will say. There's one where the audience knows and the main character doesn't, and the characters are catching up to where the audience is. And the tension that is built between those two times is what drives the story. The other example is to have no one know, to pepper in clues along the way. That's a great way, and most people will do it that way. There will be one clue, maybe a handful throughout the story that tells the reader the truth, but it needs to be so deeply woven and so innocuous that they don't see it on the first read. Now, the second and the third pass, they may start to see your clues, and you can let them see your clues at that case. But the very first time somebody reads your book, you want them guessing. You want them not to know. You want them not to understand. That's the big hit here. The audience needs to be in the dark, not in a scary way, but just in the dark about what is going on. You present a problem and they have to solve it. And they're looking for clues just as much as your main character. That's a great hallmark of mystery, because the problem that you run into is making the answer obvious. If it's clear who done it and the main character who is trying to solve that riddle doesn't know, the audience thinks they're dumb. If the audience can figure it out way too quickly, you haven't done your job. You want it to be mysterious. You want the twists to be invisible until it's too late. That can be a positive, writing in such a twists and turns way, putting in such swerves that the audience doesn't know what's coming next. That can be fun. And there are a lot of writers that can do it really well. And if you are, fantastic. Lean in on that. Lean in heavily. Make people not see what's coming. But if you plan on doing mystery, know that that is a big aspect of it. Next up is paranormal or supernatural. The positives with paranormal is a known world and known settings, usually ours, and fairly known laws. This is a good time to bring up when I say laws and rules, we are talking a lot of times about the literal laws in place. Things like speeding, for example. If it's set in the real world, in our world, all of the laws are already known. But when it comes to something that goes beyond our world, and the paranormal and the supernatural are beyond normal, that's where new laws need to be drafted. That's where a new understanding needs to happen. So what are the rules of what your, let's just call them creatures, are? You're usually going to have one or two elements. As I said in the intro, this is talking about the vampires, the werewolves, the ghosts, witches, the wizards, all that kind of stuff. That falls into paranormal. But you have to set up the rules, the whys, the hows. How do they work? Just as much as science fiction talks about technology, you have to kind of get in a little bit to what your rules are for your paranormal. Let's not just accept. The best thing you can do is fill in your laws, fill in your supernatural rules before you start. Spend some time researching the tropes that you've chosen. So let's say you're going to do a werewolf story. Read about werewolves, understand werewolves, pick and choose which elements you want for your story and stick by those. Don't break them. That is the other important factor. If you're going to introduce an element and you're going to introduce laws, stick to those laws. Don't break them. I brought up speeding. This is not the it's okay to go 5 over unwritten rule. You set up laws, stick to them. Don't make it happen one time and be changeable another time and oh, this isn't really the case and it's don't do that. When you write laws, you stick to them, because in paranormal and supernatural, it's important. You want continuity. You want that through line. You want everything grounded in the new reality. Even if we don't really have werewolves and vampires, you can still make it believable. Next up is science fiction. The good here is, much like fantasy, the world building. You get to create. You've got an open palette that you can use. The requirements that you need to keep in mind is the world building, is the research. Because it's all about technology, you have to understand. You have to know what we have and what could be. Because what could be is always based on what we have. There's no getting around the fact that you have to do that research. There's no getting around the fact that you have to understand a little bit. If you're doing something set in space, you have to understand the rules of space. You have to understand planets. You have to understand solar systems, star systems. What are distances? What are times? How do things work? You may not have to become an astronomer overnight, but you at least have to get the concept and be able to look up and find those numbers and find those meanings. The thing to bear in mind is, other than one particular property, just calling things space magic doesn't work. You need to understand it. There needs to be an explanation. This is science fiction. The key word there being science. Don't let your work be mysterious. Now, speculative, there's a difference, and that's fine. Because even with some properties, they explain how things work. It's just not technology that we have, and we're nowhere near, and it may not even be how those things could actually possibly work. But they're still defined. And that's the important distinction. They are defined in their world, and it's not really the same as ours. Not anymore. Now, that's a lot for science fiction, for the speculative side. You still need to do research. You still need to write your laws. You still need to have an understanding of how things work, whatever it is. If it's in space, you need to understand space. If it's set on Earth and there's new technology, you have to understand the properties of that technology. You have to understand that world, our world, the laws of physics, the laws of nature, thermodynamics, things like that. You have to at least grasp them in order to bend them. For hard science fiction, this is an absolute must. You cannot write hard science fiction without understanding our current levels of technology. It does not work that way. There is no speculative. And yes, I said that before, but that is the big sticking point with hard science. Hard science fiction is rigid. There is no changing. There is no, well, what if? No, this is not a what if. Hard science is what we have. Go to the extremes, yes. What is absolute possible, yes. But it's still hard science. It's still what we have. And you have to know that. You have to know what the laws as we understand them are. What are the laws of the universe as we understand them? Speculative science fiction can break those laws or bend those laws. Hard science cannot, because we cannot. Whatever we can do in the next 5 years, that is all that is allowed to be in your story. And that's fine, because there's still a lot of great science fiction and a lot of great drama that can happen with current levels of technology. Because things like long voyages through space can still happen, but they wouldn't be at light speed. They would be at a fraction of it. There can still be a lot of things that happen, and a lot of good drama, and a lot of good action, a lot of good storytelling, but it has to be grounded. I will say it is a lot easier to write speculative science fiction because you are making it all up. You get to do that. You get to decide which laws we bend and which laws we adhere to. Science fiction is one of the harder genres simply because of all of that knowledge, of all of that speculation, of all the rules of our universe and understanding them and coming up with them. That's the important part. That's why it is oftentimes seen as harder. But it's also an easy genre to do because you get to do the crafting. So long as you stay within certain bounds, you can craft. Is it possible to go faster than light and travel between stars? For us, not right now. But maybe somebody figured out the secret and you can write in that time. Or maybe they've discovered some technology we don't have, teleportation, and you can go from there. But as long as we somewhat understand it, and then you can kind of bend and figure out, well, they've done this, and it bends this law of physics. Doesn't break it, but it bends it. And we go around it and we solve the problem that way. You're still world building. You're still being speculative because we don't have those answers yet. And if you want to decide what those answers are, you get to. And that's oftentimes freeing. That's creative freedom to figure out, how did we do that? How did this alien race do it? What happened? And that can be interesting. Even if it's set now or slightly in the past and it's an alternative, that there's something that we don't know, that can be interesting too. The last genre to bring up with the good and the bad is thriller or suspense. The good here is, like many of the others, it's a known world, known technology, known rules, known laws. You're setting it in the world, you go by the world. And that is a lot easier too. That's why, if you want to write drama, but you want to get a little darker, thriller and suspense is where you go, because it is still easy to do. A lot of the grounded in reality stories are great for early writers. Because if you haven't worked out how to world build, or it seems a lot for you, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with setting something in our world, in our time. There's nothing wrong with that. You understand it. You live in it. So you know it. And that's what makes a lot of these easy. Now, when it comes to the requirements for thriller, just like horror, the reason why so many are set in the past is because of limitations of technology back then. Because a lot of thriller and suspense elements, being on the run and things like that, can be solved with technology, with today's day and age. But the difference there is, as we've seen with some movies lately, is that technology can actually be a hindrance. And that's a great way for suspense and thriller to incorporate the modern era, is that in today's day and age, using technology can be both good and bad because people can find you that way. So it's not exactly like you're helping yourself. But the thing to always remember, and the biggest aspect of thriller and suspense, is keeping the audience on the edge of their seat. You want them in for the entire ride. You want to hook them early and get them with your characters. You want them a little bit afraid. You want them nervous. You want them to feel tense, just like the main characters. That's a big aspect here. If one of the major elements of thriller and suspense is tension, the audience needs to be feeling that as well. And that's your job. And that can be hard for some people, is keeping that level of tension at some heightened level for the entire story. Once you've turned it up, to always keep it at that level, if not going higher. You always want to keep the tension. You never want to let off the gas. Don't let people have a moment. Your audience will be tired and exhausted, and they'll put the book down. But you want that. You want that so much. That's a great hook. Today, I'm not going to do a recap. That was a lot of information. That was a lot of talking. I can provide one at some point, but there's a lot of information here to remember. And don't feel bad if you want to learn some of this stuff and you want to go back and re-listen to some of it. And like I said, with the history of the genres, if you want me to go into greater detail and do just a video on each individual genre, because I'm pretty sure I glossed over a lot of the key elements in this video. If you would like me to do a genre-specific video for each genre and talk about what some of the elements are, what some of the requirements are, and things like that, I can do that. I just wanted to give you a basic overview of the genres today because there's a lot, but I can absolutely do individual genre videos and talk about what those elements are and what to look for in every genre. If you guys want that, leave me a comment and I will look into it. But for now, that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.